So this is probably the easiest step because it only has the servo and the gear. But there's a little bit of modification you need to do the servo horn that comes with it. I took a 2.5mm drill and drilled out all these holes. It's not much that you're taking off, but it's just so much that if you don't do it, you might crack this servo horn, and you don't want to do that. So I drill that out and then use these 25mm M3 screws and mount it directly to that servo horn. Again, you could use glue, but there's enough torque on this that I wanted to have an actual physical connection holding that stress, and I spread it out between 4 different 25mm screws. So each one doesn't grab very much, but between the 4 of them, they share the load, and it ends up being a successful load-bearing structure. Oops, what did I touch though? Oh, it's one little grommets. Well, I called them grommets earlier. I don't know what they are, as we discussed in the last video. And the interesting thing about these is although they come with the servo and they fit nicely into these little spots, the screws don't fit in them, so I'm not going to use those at all, which is weird, but that's the servo I got. So we'll go to the dreaded star pattern for tightening these down. And as we all know, that's so we don't mount this at some odd angle inadvertently. And again, do not over tighten these. It's not going anywhere, and you don't want to strip out and lose one of your load-bearing members. This is a really tight fit, I found. So you just kind of have to angle it on there. Then I pressed it down from the top. Trying to press it on square. That looks pretty good. Then the whole thing gets captured with this screw. Okay, so this will mount into this spot here. We use the hardware that came with it. It really helps to have a long screwdriver, and it is the smaller the better, just because these are little teeny screws, but they're just big enough that you can fit at least my long screwdriver in and drive these screws. If you don't have a long screwdriver, maybe you have a really short screwdriver that'll fit inside the box here. The key is you don't want to strip the heads of the screws out. Tweezers are your friend. There we go. And just like always, just kind of get them set in there, and then we can tighten them after the fact. And for this one, you can just use a regular length screwdriver. All right, so we'll use our little star pattern one more time. Make sure we're not getting this thing mounted at a weird angle. Yeah, I wish I had a slightly smaller, big, long screwdriver, but this is what I got. All right, that looks good. Now we'll set its initial position with our servo tester. And again, this isn't super critical because we can adjust this all with our control software. But I'm going to set it at its bottom of its rotation. So that lifts it, that puts it down, and that's at the bottom. So now we're at the point where we can put this whole thing together. So what we're going to do is simulate that I mounted this box into the droid, and it's sitting on the side of the droid. So the first thing I'm going to do is mount the leg to the body of the droid. Remember, we've got 2 captured nuts in these channels here, and then we just simply insert these legs or these struts into the leg, which can be a little bit tricky depending on how accurate your prints are. So once those are mounted, you secure them with 2 M50 screws. And what we're going to do is tighten these down. All right, so once those are tightened, we now can attach the motor. And this can be a little tricky just because of the infrastructure that's involved. The problem we have is the bearings have this little inner gap here, and that's the actual thing that holds the bearing. So what I want to do is add my spring and then an 8mm bearing, 8mm washer, then a 10mm washer, so that it goes in here, and all the load of that spring is now on the washers and not on the actual bearing assembly. So you want to be super careful with this when you're putting it together, because if you get a big angle, you'll actually knock the little ball bearings inside that chamber out. If you can see, and there's little ball bearings in this assembly, and we don't want to knock those bearings out because then that ruins the assembly. So you have to kind of get these things lined up and ready to go, and then very carefully and somewhat clumsily have this hardware stacked up and then inserted into this chain. So again, I'm simulating this is in the droid. So it comes in from the top. We get the 8mm washer, the 10mm washer, and then we corral this into position and very gently push down because we don't want to knock out those ball bearings. And then we do the same thing again here. We'll get our washers ready, our spring, push it down, capture the spring, and then capture our washers. Get enough. And this is critical here. This is where I've messed up and actually popped bearings out myself. So the trick is to get it in here so you're not at a weird angle. All right, so that works. Now all we have to do is push the rods into the bottom channels so they seat. And you can see right now they're not seated because they're sitting proud of the channel here. So you kind of have to wiggle this around. Yep, there's one. And while I have that, I'll put my keeper in place so it doesn't come out while I'm working. This is held in position with a 25mm M3 screw. And this is going into plastic, so don't over tighten it, but just make sure that it's not sitting with a gap. All right, that's good. And now I just have to kind of cajole this one into position. And this might be tricky if this is actually mounted on the droid. But I couldn't think of any other way of making it go together. I think in the future, if you do the front one first and the back one second, because you can reach at the back one better for more twisting. There we go. And then we just put the keeper in, secure it with a 25mm screw, and that will basically complete the Imposs-A-Drive build. You do this 3 more times and you will have a completed B2-EMO Imposs-A-Drive, which would be amazing and impossible. But there we go.